Hey everyone, Nathan here, Absurd Being. So we are into the second video on Freud, and just to recap, in the last video we looked at psychic content, so the psyche itself, and in this video we're looking at the psychical apparatus, so kind of the way that the psyche actually works, how the psyche is formed, if you like. But, and this is kind of a key point, Derrida and through Freud is going to investigate this question not through a kind of a biological approach, looking or a neuroscientific one, but through metaphor. So everything that we're talking about in this video, we're going to be talking about neurons a lot, but none of this should be understood as physical, as Derrida is going to say, as morphological. It's all metaphorical. In order to not understand what the brain is doing, not understand the physical side of the mind, but in order to understand the mind, how the mind is working, how the mind is operating. So it's a metaphorical model, even though we're talking about neurons. So just keep that in mind as we go through this video. So I've divided it into two parts. There are two kinds of metaphors actually here. The first metaphors concerning the neurons themselves, and the second metaphor is the writing apparatus as a whole, how that kind of operates. So as we go through, I think that'll become clearer, but we'll make a start on the first part of the video, which is metaphor, three kinds of neurons. So the three kinds of neurons, we'll start with the first kind for Freud / Derrida. I think I'll just say Derrida from now on, from here on out. And the first kind are permeable, he calls permeable neurons. And the idea with this is that these neurons offer no resistance to an excitation. So the importance of that, the significance of that, is that they then retain no trace. So the excitation kind of takes place, they don't resist it, it just flows through them, setting up this or flows through the neurons in this channel, in this pathway, and that's all. Nothing's left behind, there's no imprint made anywhere. And so this metaphor, this first metaphor of these permeable neurons, is designed to capture the notion of perception. So it's something like a mechanistic reception of sense impressions as they just set off a cascading pathway of neurons, and nothing's left behind. There's no trace retained, there's no preference for this pathway. It's just a kind of a momentary triggering of these neurons. And so that these permeable neurons, this metaphor of permeable neurons is designed to capture what it is to perceive. And then the second kind of neurons are impermeable. And what Derrida has to say about these neurons would oppose contact barriers to the quantity of excitation, would thus retain the printed trace. They thus afford a possibility of representing memory. So these impermeable neurons, because they resist that excitation that the sense impressions create, they allow what Derrida calls breaching. And this is essentially the tracing of a trail or a pathway through the brain, through these impermeable neurons. And this printed trace, he calls it there, is what enables memory. And so that's the distinction between the first permeable neurons, which were perception. These neurons enable memory. They retain a trace of the excitation. And they do this because there is resistance. As Derrida says, they oppose contact barriers to the quantity of excitation. So there's resistance, and it's that which creates this printed trace, this retention of that excitation. So a couple of things to note about memory then. Memory is not a psychical property like others. It is, Derrida says, the very essence of the psyche. And this is quite important. And this, I think, goes back perhaps even to Bergson, who says something similar. For him, the importance of memory can't be overstated. And Derrida is saying something very similar here. Essentially, without memory, there is no psyche. It is what makes up a conscious being's conscious life, that memory. If you don't have a memory, you don't have this ability to, you don't have this, if you don't have memory, you don't have that continuance, that continuation of experience. And it's hard to see how you could have anything that you could call a psyche without that. And another thing that's interesting here is the way Derrida talks about this breaching happening. And even the word breach, he says the path is broken, cracked, fracta, breached. These words are very violent. So it brings back in this connotation which we've seen in prior videos, that there's a violent aspect to what Derrida is talking about. And I quite like that for some reason. I think in part because it goes against this notion that we kind of tend to think these days, I think, that we look for smoothness and harmony and cohesion as kind of representing truth. And maybe that's a consequence of physics, which looks for beauty and elegance in its equations and things like that. But there's a strong, it's not even an undertone, it's a theme in Derrida of violence, and this being at the core of human experience. And it crops up here again with memory, these impermeable neurons. There's that pathway being traced is a violent act. It's a breaching, because you have this resistance to that excitation, and it's that which, like I said, allows a pathway to be retained, that excitation to leave a mark, and which allows memory. So another thing that's important with these impermeable neurons and memory is the notion of difference. Surprise, surprise. An equality of resistance to breaching, or an equivalence of the breaching forces, would eliminate any preference in the choice of itinerary. Memory would be paralyzed. It is the difference between breaches which is the true origin of memory, and thus of the psyche. Only this difference enables a pathway to be preferred. Trace as memory is not a pure breaching that might be reappropriated at any time as simple presence. It is rather the ungraspable and invisible difference between breaches. We thus already know that psychic life is neither the transparency of meaning nor the opacity of force, but the difference within the exertion of forces. So the trace that is memory is not a simple presence. It isn't those pathways themselves that have been traced out in response to that excitation. Rather, it appears in, Derrida calls, the ungraspable and invisible differences between the breaches. And this is really important, I think, to grasp. Memory is the difference between these traces. And I think a good analogy for this is the way that now and later, in a temporal sense, arise not just from having a continuous flow of time, nor from just a string of events, but only from perceiving or being able to perceive the difference between those events. That's what creates a sense of now and later. But without that difference, there is no now and later. It's just one event after another in a continuous succession. The secret, Derrida is saying here, by my analogy, is that it's the gap. It's the thing that's missing between the events, between the positive features. That is what allows us to talk about now and later, what sets up that ability. And it's the same thing with memory. It's not the positive, present even traces that are actual things. Rather, it's the no things, the nothings in between that make up difference, that make up memory, that allow there to be this, that allow memory to arise. And I think that's a really important idea here. And as Derrida says, this is why equivalence, or the lack of preference, would be the death of memory, because it would annihilate difference. If the resistance to the breaching was all the same, or if the breaching forces themselves were all the same, if there was an equivalence there, then it makes no sense to talk of a difference anymore. But there has to be this difference in some sense, and we'll see in a minute some of the different ways that Derrida sees difference cropping up here. But another important idea is the way that we can understand this as quantity. So essentially a measurable stimulus becomes psyche and memory, namely through difference. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit later as well, but this is another important idea. The permeable neurons for perception, they dealt only with quantity, with that measurable external force, that excitation, which is measurable, which is quantitative. And it's purely quantity when it comes to perception. Here, though, we're taking that quantity and getting something different out of it. We're not getting just a brute representation of it. We're getting a nuanced, different, we're morphing it into something that is no longer purely quantitative. It's a transition of that physical quantity into a cognitive feature, memory. And it happens not by adding more quantity, not by increasing the intensity of the quantity, the excitations, the sense impressions, but through the differences between those sense impressions becoming salient, becoming significant. And so, like I say, I'm going to talk about this later, I think, and also in the summary, but we've moved from pure quantity and perception. now to we've transformed that quantity into the mental, into the psyche, and we're gonna go one step further in a moment, but let's not go there just yet. So I said I wanted to mention some of these differences, a few kinds of difference that Derrida references, and the first is differences between quantities. So between those printed traces, those pathways. So you can have different pathways arising from different sense impressions, through different excitations, and there's a difference between those. That's the first kind. The second kind is the interval between repetitions of the same impression. So those firings of neurons in a particular path, that printed trace, the same firing, the same pathway, but an interval between when that pathway is activated. That's another form of difference. It's another way difference arises here. And finally, the interval between the breachings themselves. So different pathways, but the timing between when those different pathways form, when they arise. That's another way difference appears in this metaphorical model. And so that difference is what generates memory. We can also talk about this in terms of deferral. And Derrida says the same thing, the same idea of difference can be understood as deferral. And this goes right back to the very beginning of the series where we talked about those two different meanings of difference with an A for Derrida, which included to differ, but also to defer or delay. All these differences in the production of the trace may be reinterpreted as moments of deferring. This movement is described as the effort of life to protect itself by deferring a dangerous cathexis, that is, by constituting a reserve. The threatening expenditure or presence are deferred with the help of breaching or repetition. Is this not already the detour which institutes the relation of pleasure to reality? So we've got the cathexis, which is the investing of emotional or psychic energy into a person, object, or idea. And this is what Derrida is talking about being deferred. So that cathexis is deferred through the institution of memory, which in a way preserves that stimulation. It retains it into memory. So in essence, it's like saying this excitation, this event doesn't have to be dealt with now. It can be stored. It can be put into reserve. And that's essentially what memory is doing. Contrast this maybe with, say, a lower life form, say a dog, still intelligent, but very much living in the present moment. It doesn't have the same capacity that human beings do for deferring. Its temporal window is much narrower than human beings. Obviously, dogs remember, but there's the emphasis is still on, I think, this a narrower slice of reality, dealing with the present, dealing with current sense impressions, takes up a lot more of a dog's life than it does for a human being. And the way Derrida's framing this here is as a kind of deferral. That's what memory does, this enhanced capacity for memory that we have. is acting like a deferral of these dangerous or a dangerous cathexis. It's storing it, putting it into reserve. We can deal with it later. And at the end of that quote, he says, this is also the detour by which the pleasure principle, we called this the primary process, I think in the last video, is delayed into the reality principle, or the secondary process, the intellect, logic kind of coming in at that point. But that is the driver, or the engine, or the way in which the pleasure principle is superseded by the reality principle through memory. So memory is really playing an important role here for Freud, and through Freud for Derrida as well. And we've also got this notion of repetition. He mentioned it in that quote, and we will talk about repetition in the very last video of this series, but I do want to just bring it up here because he does mention it quite a lot. So I've got a quote: "For repetition does not happen to an initial impression. Its possibility is already there in the resistance offered the first time by the psychical neurons. Resistance itself is possible only if the opposition of forces lasts and is repeated at the beginning. It is the very idea of a first time which becomes enigmatic. In the first time of the contact between two forces, repetition has begun." So this is another theme of Derrida's, that there is no originary first primary event. There's already this. He's working against the notion that it's all positive, right? That if you trace things back to their origin, there's going to be a positive event at the start of it. Because for Derrida, what starts everything is difference, right? And so this is just, he's building on that same theme with this idea of repetition. Repetition can't trace back to an original positive event, which is then just replayed or reproduced. Repetition can't be that because there is no original positive event. And so what Derrida is saying here is that repetition isn't that. It isn't the reproduction of an original positive event. Rather, repetition is already a part of the first time. So not even the first positive event, but the first time. Because that first time is full of difference. It's grounded in difference. And the repetition then, it's built into that first time, that original difference, in the sense that in order for the pathway to be formed in the first place, in order for that printed trace to arise in the first place, the force must breach. And this requires a sustained effort over time, a continual application of that force. And that is what Derrida is what Derrida's claiming is repetition, is how he sees repetition arising here. Not as an initial positive impression which is then reproduced, but it's because it's already in that initial impression, through the fact that there's resistance. So the resistance requires a repetition to form that pathway. That's how I understand him talking about repetition here. And like I said, we'll talk more about this in the last video, but that's just, I think, it's important to get that in there because he does mention this in this section of the book. And this brings us to the last kind of neurons, which are perceptual. So these neurons represent consciousness. And consciousness is defined as that which gives us qualities, that which brings about qualities. And this will maybe make more sense a little bit later, differences that are pure quality. So how and where do the qualities originate? Neither outside nor inside. They cannot be in the external world where the physicist recognizes only quantities, masses and motion and nothing else, nor in the interiority of the psyche, i.e. or memory, for reproducing or remembering are without quality. So this third set of neurons, the ones which are the perceptual neurons, according to this, in this metaphorical model, are excited along with perception, but not with reproduction. And their excitation gives rise to qualities. So we're talking about something completely different from the prior two kinds of neurons, which is why we need this metaphorical third kind. So we've gone from pure quantities in perception to the psyche, the psychic, the transformation of quantity from the physical into the difference between quantities in the psyche, memory. And now we're looking at a third difference, which is moving away from quantity completely into qualities. And this is what defines consciousness. And Derrida says something interesting there, which is worth pulling up. He says consciousness and memory, or he says reproducing or remembering are without quality. In other words, consciousness and memory are mutually exclusive. And this is interesting. And this is, by the way, the exact opposite of what Bergson says. I mentioned him a little bit earlier. For him, consciousness is memory. I think that's a quote, actually. He says that. But then that's to do with the way that they're defining consciousness, I think. But it's an important point that Derrida is making here. Consciousness and memory are mutually exclusive because consciousness is the awareness or the arising of qualities, whereas memory is the difference between quantities. So that's kind of, you're dealing with completely different kinds of things here. Also, consciousness is always present. It's another way to think about this. The reason why consciousness and memory mutually exclusive. Consciousness is, again, it's in the definition that consciousness is a present awareness. You can be conscious of something that's happened in the past, but your conscious awareness of that past event is present. Consciousness is always, it's rooted in the present. So again, different from memory. Also, another way to pass this idea is that we don't actually remember in terms of qualities. And this, I think, and this is what he says at the end of that quote, reproducing or remembering are without quality. And at first it took me a while to get my head around that. But if you think about it, you don't remember qualities as such. You remember the fact of certain qualities. So you remember, for example, when you think of a sound that you heard or a piece of music, you don't rehear those qualities. When you think about it, when you remember it, you know the qualities that you heard, but you know them without re-experiencing those qualities. That is what memory is. It's not a replay of a past event. It's kind of it's a factual or propositional grasp of what happened, but it's not a direct reproduction of what happened. So you don't actually re-experience qualities in memory, because those qualities are experienced in consciousness at the time, in the present. So that I thought was a very interesting idea and worth thinking about. But there is a problem then, Derrida says here. This idea, this notion of these perceptual neurons yields a permeability and a breaching which proceed from no quantity at all. From what then? From pure time, from pure temporalization in its conjunction with spacing, from periodicity. Only recourse to temporality and to a discontinuous or periodic temporality will allow the difficulty to be resolved. So what we're talking about with these perceptual neurons is, as he says, there's a permeability and a breaching that happen without quantity. We've moved, like I said, we've moved from quantity in perception, we've moved from differences in quantities in memory to quality, a fundamentally different kind of thing. So where does this permeability and breaching, where does this this kind of excitation arise from if it doesn't arise from quantities? And Derrida's answer is from time, pure time and spacing. So the time that he's talking about is is duration, not the kind of not the time of physics, I would say, and not like a container time where we imagine time as a dimension in which things flow or progress in some kind of temporal dimension, which is really visualized as just another kind of spatial dimension, just one that's extended into time, whatever that might mean. So the time that he's talking about is a kind of continuous duration, not the container time or the dimensional time of science. And the space that he's talking about is discontinuity. So interval, space as interval, not the dimensional space of science, which again, like time, is external, is quantity related, is able to be worked into physical equations because it's just another physical quantity. It's another measurable quantity. And when you do that, this time plus the space that Derrida is talking about, you get periodicity. And this is what this is where the quality that is consciousness arises. So instead of receiving quantities, the perceptual neurons appropriate the period of the excitation. And that is, as a lot of this is a direct reference, a direct quote from Freud. So all of this is permeated with Freud's thought. But yeah, the neurons appropriate the period of the excitation, and that is what brings about quality. And appropriating the period of the excitations like this is precisely what Derrida calls pure difference. That is to say, difference without quantity, difference that has no relation, no connection to quantity, and it's what yields quality. Okay, so we've got that metaphorical model of three kinds of neurons to capture how the psyche works, how the psyche is formed through those three experiences: perception, memory, and consciousness. But there's a problem with this in that memory requires that permanent modifications are able to be made to the system. So permanent changes can be made. But in order for modifications to happen at all, this requires that the system be perpetually open to the reception of new impressions. So how can it be that the system is both perpetually open to new impressions and also has those new impressions become permanent through memory, through this retention of the trace? That's the problem Derrida talks about here, and the solution to it is another metaphor, the metaphor of a writing apparatus, and that takes us into the second part of the video. So how does seeing the mind as a writing apparatus solve this problem? Derrida traces three analogies that Freud makes, and we'll go through them one by one. The first analogy is to supplement meaning by imagining writing a note on an external surface that receives the marks but doesn't preserve them. And this Freud calls the mystic pad, and it's something which is, I think it's something we can imagine, like if you remember those Etch-a-Sketch devices we had as kids. You could draw on it, and then I think the one I had, you slid a slide across the paper, the plasticky kind of cover, and it erased everything you did. And you could do it again and then move that slider back and it would erase everything again. So that's the idea here, a kind of Etch-a-Sketch, an external surface receives marks, doesn't preserve them. And this, Derrida says, joins the two empirical certainties in humans. First, the infinite depth in the implication of meaning, in the unlimited envelopment of the present. That's a quote. So it preserves for us this notion of meaning being infinite. We can create as much meaning as we like. We can, through this metaphor of the Etch-a-Sketch, the mystic pad, we're able to create as much meaning as we like. We can build our philosophies and our thoughts and our ways of understanding. We can move them in any direction with complete freedom. And the second empirical certainty is what he calls the pellicular essence of being, the absolute absence of any foundation. So pellicle meaning like a thin membrane. And the idea here is that, and this is Derrida's point, one of the main theme, if you like, of Derrida, is that there's no foundation. We talked about this before. There is no positive origin. And the Etch-a-Sketch again captures that. There's nothing permanent here. There's nothing at bottom. All you have are the marks that you write on the Etch-a-Sketch, but they are erased in the next moment when you want to write something different. So it preserves those two empirical certainties, infinite depth and meaning, and the absence of any foundation. However, it fails to satisfy that double requirement that we have of it, which is that it allow for permanent modifications, but also allow that the system be perpetually open to new impressions. And the reason for this is that the spaces that belong to this model all belong to geometry and are therefore purely exterior. So without relation to themselves, there's no substance to them. They're all external and all individual and divided. The space that this metaphor is operating within is all external, and all of the events that happen in it are discrete and separate from each other. There's no connection. And this means that all we have is reception. So this analogy is insufficient. This brings us to the second analogy, which is where a permanent trace remains in the wax block of the mystic pad. So, and now we're moving away from the Etch-a-Sketch, but the mystic pad, and I'm not sure exactly what it was made of, but there's some kind of membrane, or membrane's not a good word. There's like a plasticky covering on top, and when you write on it, it makes contact with some surface below, and that leaves a trace on that plasticky cover, and it's the contact that means that something can be left behind. And then when you lift that cover, the contact's broken and the writing disappears, and you put it back down and you can write again. And so what Derrida's talking about here with the second analogy, and Freud, is that you make your writing on the plastic film, and when you lift it, there's that what you imprinted is retained not in the plastic film, but in that waxy layer underneath. So it's always there's always a trace of the marks that you made in that wax block. And this is actually, I think, a reference to the unconscious. And I got a quick quote for this. Writing supplements perception before perception even appears to itself, is conscious of itself. Memory or writing is the opening of that process itself. The perceived may be read only in the past, beneath perception, and after it. So the memory traces the writing that are memory, supplements perception before the impression is even perceived, because it's the very background upon which that perception is formed. So memory then is the beginning of perception. It's, as Derrida says in that quote, the opening of that process. And it's, again, memory and writing is being pulled into the spotlight here. Another important idea for Derrida, that this idea of writing, a writing apparatus, the way the mind works through a kind of written process. So we have, with the second analogy then, we've got the layer on top, which receives impressions, and then they can be erased, but the impressions are retained in that wax block underneath that film on top. And it's those memory traces are crucial. They're central to what happens, what is recorded in that film, that top top layer. But still, even with this second analogy, we're still missing the answer to this solution of how we can have the system it can receive permanent modifications, but at the same time be open to new impressions. Because all we've done is we've moved from allowing us to receive impressions to the permanent modification of that system. And so we're still missing the analogy that would bring those together. We've gone from the film, the mystic pad, we were able to write and record on the mystic pad, to having permanent traces left behind in the wax under the film, that plastic layer on top that gives us the permanence. But we're missing what it is that can put these two things together. And the reason is that in both the first and the second analogies, we haven't gone beyond the external space of writing. It's still, the second analogy doesn't get us any further, doesn't bring us any closer to uniting the two, because it's doing the same thing that the first analogy did, in the sense that it's operating in the same kind of realm, in this external, everything's separate, one by one kind of way of thinking. It gives us permanence, but it gives us permanence through the same approach. And what we need is something we need a fundamentally different way of thinking to bring those two, the first and the second analogies, together. And that's what the third analogy does with time. So the third analogy builds the time of writing into the structure of the mystic pad, into the metaphor of the mystic pad. And this is that periodicity that we talked about earlier. So I've got a quote from Freud here. If we imagine one hand writing upon the surface of the mystic writing pad, while another periodically raises its covering sheet from the wax slab, we shall have a concrete representation of the way in which I tried to picture the functioning of the perceptual apparatus of our mind. So the memory traces then are born from this double force of repetition and erasure, legibility and illegibility, Derrida says. And that it's that which lets us bring these two things together. So the inclusion of time brings in, lets us unite those two purely spatial, external analogies and put them together. So we have over a duration, we have the operation of the mystic pad. This is what lets the permanence and the openness to new sense impressions, it lets those two features coexist. And also it's a nice counterpoint, I think, to, again, that kind of positivistic era that we live in, that where everything is thought of in terms of positivity, and it's actual events that matter. Whereas what Derrida is saying here is it's actually the erasure of events that is what allows the mind to do its job. It's not just the positive forces, the quantitative physical forces that create the mind, or that allow the mind to come about. It's this erasure. It's this illegibility that is the operative force here. It's not just this one-sided positive physical quantitative force. There's this other, the gaps between it, the periodicity between these events. That's where the magic happens. And I quite like that idea. And you'll notice too that we've just kind of traced the same path that we did with in the first part of the video with those 3 neurons, the quantity in perception, and then we went to the difference between quantities in memory, and then qualities in consciousness. We've done something very similar here, gone from the writing on the film of the mystic pad as a pure kind of perception, to the retention of the trace in the wax tablet underneath that covering layer as memory. And now we've incorporated time, periodicity, to give us this full picture of how the mind works. And that's the analogy. And Derrida likes it, obviously, because it's all about writing, right? It brings in writing, which is obviously central to Derrida's whole philosophy. It puts writing, again, I said this before, but puts it at center stage as the way in which the mind works. And another point that is important in that, related to this notion of erasure being at the heart of mind, not just the positive, the writing itself, but the erasing of that writing as being just as important, is the notion of repression. Writing is unthinkable without repression. The condition for writing is that there be neither a permanent contact nor an absolute break between strata, the vigilance and failure of censorship. So we've kind of identified in that third analogy, that metaphor, the necessity for multiple strata in a mind, and at least 3. Right, and Derrida says we must be several in order to write and even to perceive. So we must have that layer of pure perception, that layer of memory, and that layer of consciousness. And there can't be a permanent contact or an absolute break between these different strata, or mind, the human mind, is impossible. Hence, we need an active way to establish and cut off connection between these strata. And that's where the metaphor of the censor comes in. And this all brings us to the conclusion, which is the answer to that question we posed at the beginning: how can permanent modifications be made to a system while that system is always open to new impressions? The perceptions are repressed as they are delivered into memory. And I think there's a real depth to that insight, to that understanding. Perceptions come in, and then they're recorded into memory. But as they're recorded into memory, as they're preserved, as they're retained in memory, they are repressed. And this means that memory is unconscious. And again, this might be something that I think if you hear this for the first time, you'll think, that's not true. I'm conscious of my memories all the time. But you're only conscious of your memories when you think about them, right? The rest of the time, you are not thinking about the past. You spend all of your time in the present, focusing on the present. And it's only when you deliberately turn your attention back to the past that it comes back. So they're not gone. Those past events haven't gone. They're in your memory. But the mistake is we think we have our conscious awareness is spanning every moment of that has happened to us, right? We think we're aware of the present and the whole past all at the same time. But in actual fact, if you think about it, you're not aware of the past. It is unconscious. Not in the sense that it's unreachable or that you have to go to spend years in psychoanalysis, psychotherapy or whatever to dredge them up, but in the sense that you're not consciously aware of them at the present moment. However, even though you're not consciously aware of them, they are informing and colouring every present moment. You are the entirety of your past, even though it's unconscious. Even though it's been repressed. Not into the blackness of a depth where you need hours of therapy in order to recover them, but repressed in the sense that you're not aware of them right now. You're not aware of your past right now. Memory and consciousness are mutually exclusive. Those memories have been shifted into this unconscious realm where nevertheless they inform your present and you still have access to them anytime you choose to think about them, but as you're living your life they are unconscious. And I like that idea. And again, it's just a nice counterpoint to the positivistic era, the era driven by science that we live in, where everything it's all about the positive, what happens, actual physical events. That's where we're locked in on. But there's this other part, there's this other side. There's a repression that's at the core of the human mind, what it is to be a human being. Just nice to pull that out. Cool. So let's have a look at a summary. First up, the first metaphor, 3 kinds of neurons. So the first one was the permeable, and this is designed to capture perception, characterized by the lack of a trace. These neurons don't retain a trace of the excitations. And what's central to the idea of these permeable neurons is the notion of quantity. So they are purely driven by sense impressions. External sense impressions impinge on them and create the drive through stimulating them, exciting them. That's all they are, just the pure result of these physical quantities. Then the second kind of neurons were the impermeable ones, and these are memory. So because they oppose a barrier to an excitation, they therefore retain a trace. There's an effort that has to go through. It's a kind of breaching, Derrida calls it. This brought in this notion of violence being at the core of the psyche. And memory arises as a result of this, the fact that a trace can be retained, but memory itself is in the difference between quantities. So memory is not present, it's not the breachings themselves, but it arises from the differences between those breachings. And this can also be understood, Derrida said, as a deferral of a dangerous cathexis. So preserving something in memory, preserving this excitation in memory, means it doesn't have to be dealt with immediately. We can delay, we can defer, we can put it aside, and it can become relevant later. Repetition also appeared here, but in the unique way that Derrida is using it, because there's no foundation for Derrida, there's no positive origin for Derrida. Repetition can't be just the reproduction of an initial event. Rather, this repetition is a part of the initial tracing itself, the initial impression itself. So that initial force, that breaching force, is already repeated in the fact that it requires a sustained effort to breach, to create those mental pathways. So repetition is a key part of memory, but not repetition in the way that we normally think of it. Then this brings us to the third kinds of neurons, which were the perceptual neurons, and this was consciousness, and this was differences that are pure quality. So that's how Derrida defined consciousness here, as qualities, the arising, if you like, of qualities. And there was a kind of, there's a need for these neurons, because consciousness as qualities can't come from the external world, which is pure quantity, which we saw in perception, can't come from the internal world of the psyche and memory, which is the differences between quantities. So it's this new kind of event, a pure qualitative event. And these neurons are excited, Derrida said, along with perception, but not with reproduction or memory. And the point of that is that consciousness and memory are mutually exclusive. The qualities that are consciousness arise from the period of the excitation. So this is explaining how we get qualities, how consciousness can come about as quality in a world where all we see or all we recognize are quantities. And it comes about through the inclusion basically of time as duration and space as discontinuity. And this gives us that period. And that's where qualities have their source. So this is then not just difference, but pure difference, i.e. difference without quantity. And then the second part of the video was the second metaphor, the writing apparatus. And this metaphor is designed to explain how the system can allow both permanence while at the same time being perpetually open to new impressions. We went through three analogies. The first analogy was the mystic writing pad, the Etch-a-Sketch, and this gave us that perceptual frame, so reception only. The second analogy, the permanent traces left in the wax block underneath that covering layer. This gave us memory as the background upon which perception arises. So it gives us that permanent aspect, but again, like the first analogy, purely external. It's all quantitative here. We're missing that which brings about the full richness of the mind, which is allows both permanence and a perpetual openness to new impressions. And this brought us to the third analogy, which included time as periodicity. So the repetition in perception and the erasure as those perceptions went into memory gives us, over time, over a period, gives us the solution to what we were looking for in the form of repression. So this fully answered our question. Perceptions are repressed as they go into memory, and it's that which allows, which fully captures what happens in the mind through this metaphor of writing. Okay, and that brings us to the end of the 2 videos on Freud. We're coming to the end of this series, although I know I'm slowing down a lot. I'm not doing videos every week at the moment. My day for videos has become, I'm just busy, actually. I'm just really busy. But we are coming to the end of this series. I envision 4 more videos, and the next video we're going to look at is subjectivity and consciousness, which I said I was going to look at before, but then I wasn't actually going to do a video on Freud. But as I was going through my notes, I was like, okay, I can't skip this. It's too central it's too important in what Derrida has to say, I think, to leave it. So those 2 videos on Freud, but the next video, subjectivity and consciousness, and then after that there's only 3 videos left. So we're getting there. Okay, let me wrap up here. Thanks for watching. Hopefully that helped a little bit, and I'll see you next time.